Okay, so hello everyone. Welcome to attend my presentation. So my talk is about visual effect in picture books, a multimodal discourse analysis perspective. So in this talk, I'm going to share the research background and the design of the research, and I'm going to talk about some critical findings and its discussion. So first, the research background of this work is based on previous work on non-linguistic semiotic modes, especially those static images from an SFMDA perspective. SFMDA referring to systemic functional multimodal discourse analysis. So I draw on previous work on those static images, for example, Christopher Leuven's work and economist's work on a news photo, and also those visual semiosis in picture book stories. So I pay more attention to the evaluative aspects of picture books. So the aim of this research is to describe the ways in which emotions of story characters, that is called visual affect, are realized in picture book stories by drawing on this SFMDA perspective. In particular, I focus on describing the role of visual images played in the meaning-making process of construing or expressing those social emotions. Here, social emotion is referring to the emotion that depends on other people. For example, the emotion of like frustration or love, or the emotion of like jealous, those kind of emotions. So the design of the research, I'm going to talk about two aspects. One is what kind of data is being used, and secondly is the analytical approach used in this study, namely the instantiation approach. So the data used in this study is different from those in previous work on picture books, because previous work tend to examine children's picture book stories. However, it has been argued that as a storytelling medium, picture books can deal with more complicated themes such as war, romantic relationships, and so on, which can target at much wider readership. Therefore, it remains questionable that whether the meaning-making systems developed from examining children's picture books can be applied to the picture books, to describing picture books in different contexts or written for different social functions. Therefore, against this background, this study selected two Chinese picture book stories authored by Jimmy Liao, and these two picture book stories can be considered as the representative work of adult picture book or 成人绘本, which is popular in the region of Taiwan or Great China. The term adult picture book or 成人绘本 has been coined, especially in Taiwan, to referring to those picture books targeted at more mature readers. Okay. So in this table, it summarizes the published information about the two picture book stories. So one is called Turn Left, Turn Right. Another one is called The Starry, Starry Night. They are selected as the primary data source for the current investigation. So Turn Left, Turn Right is concerned with a romantic story taking place between two adults in an urban environment, while the Starry, Starry Night is the story about the growing pains of two teenager characters who live in an urban environment as well. So both picture book stories, as we can see, revolve around the social emotions such as love or frustration as generated by the story protagonist. So in terms of their physical properties, well, most children's picture book stories consist of like 32 pages, namely 16 spreads. Liao's picture book stories actually are much longer, of a length arguably comparable to the graphic novels. So in terms of the analytical approach, so this study adopts an instantiation approach, which has been developed in SFL tradition. So when looking at a language from an instantiation perspective, it means that we look at language as a social semiotic system. So that is the meaning-making potential of a language. And also we look at how the system is instantiated or actualized in a particular instance of a language use, for example, a text, on the kind of generalization. So from this perspective, we can approach language as meaning-making options, generalized as systems, and at the same time, the meaning-making options are instantiated or actualized in particular instances as text into particular kinds of like a language feature. So for example, the system of appraisal, okay, so for example, the affect particular option of affect is instantiated as particular grammatical choices in a particular text. So this kind of idea can also be applied to the describing of the non-linguistic mode. So in the current study, we adopt an instantiation approach for describing evaluative meanings actualized through the images in two picture book stories. So as illustrated in this figure, the study focusing on two perspectives of visual evaluative meanings in picture book images. So by examining the picture book images involved in the two picture book stories, I described the system choices pertaining to evaluative meanings being foregrounded. So this stage involved the application of the meaning-making systems developed in previous studies of visual images, such as ambience and visual effect, to the data. And on the other hand, I also revised available systems or developed new systems based on generalization of the visual features identified in the data. So in other words, first I will apply what has already been investigated, what has already been developed. I look at whether it is applicable to use those systems to describe the current two picture books. And also I look at from this data to see like what new systems can be developed and also what kind of revision can be developed, can be made on the current available system choices. Okay, so then I will report some key findings of the investigation, especially focusing on 3 aspects. Okay, and also because of time limitation, I will focus more on this visual aspect, like the images. So I will not talk a lot about this the coupling of image and verbal text, although they are quite important aspect of the meaning making process. So 3 key findings I would like to report. Firstly is the role of facial expressions as the visual resources for the representing emotions of story characters in Liao's picture books. Secondly is the idea of the evoking shared affect in readers to get the social emotional values. And also I will specify 3 particular ways of evoking attitudes identified in Liao's picture books. That is figurative, intensive, and unfolding. Okay. So one of the characteristics of images in Liao's picture books stories is that the story characters are depicted usually in a minimalist style and as the distance from readers most of the time. And the emotional state of the story characters, that is whether they're happy or not, is difficult to pinpoint solely through their facial expressions. So as we can see in this example images, so story protagonists often of both stories tend to be depicted in ways in which their facial expression provide little clue on the emotional state of the story characters. And compared with the facial expressions, it is found that Liao's picture book stories tend to employ more of the visual making strategies of triggering or evoking emphatic responses or shared affect in readers. So the notion of shared affect is developed by Economos' work on news photo, so which refers to the evocation of the emphatic responses through which readers can, to varying degrees, feel the actual enjoyment or pain of the human participant depicted, if he or she is ideationally construed as engaging in a joyful or painful activity. So in other words, if a photo construed an activity of construed a person is acting is suffering some kind of pain, and then as a viewers of this photo, then it's very likely that the viewers will the feelings of pain will be evoked in this reader as well. Okay, so therefore, in my investigation, I adopted and further developed Economos' idea of visually inscribing and evoking attitudes by proposing a spectrum of visually expressing the emotional value of story characters, which is called sentiment. So as can be seen in this slide, while I use the formalism of system networks from SFL tradition, the meaning-making options are written in lowercase in square brackets. I would argue that this study, in this study, I would argue that instead of foreground this either-or distinctions by using the format of system networks, they are more appropriate to be proposed as a spectrum of visual meaning-making strategies. So And these visual meaning making strategies are very likely to be co-deployed within one particular image. So I use the label of overt to generalize the strategy of expressing emotional value through the facial expressions. So you can see how people use, for example, previous work on Tian's work or Economos' work have already looked at those, the way in which the facial expressions can display whether this character is happy or not happy in general, in a generalized sense. So they are also called, in those studies are also called visual inscription. So overt option is similar to those visual inscription identified in previous work. And then I use the label covert to indicate those emotional values that are expressed not from those facial expressions, but from some other visual meaning making resources, such as colors or like the layout or like some construed visual event. Okay, so these three ways of visual strategies of evoking readers' emphatic responses are identified in those picture book stories. So which including affording, figurative, and intensive. So the table in this slide summarizes the meaning-making choices of this covert and their actualization in Liao's picture book images. So as indicated in this table, options of the sentiment is conceptualized as involving two levels of abstraction. The meaning-making potential of sentiment, overt and covert, is the generalized visual meaning-making strategies situated at the pole of system, and the particular configuration of visual elements within an image or across images is the instantiation or actualization in particular instances of text, namely the two picture book stories involved in this study. Therefore, as you can see, this study is exploratory in nature. So this is just some proposed kinds of covert features based on the analysis of the images involved in these two picture books. And much more data is needed to test and also to readjust the specific features of the covert. So here, three particular ways of covert are identified. For figure to refer to the employment of symbolic icons in the images, and the icons could be within the story, that's called diegetic, and also there could be some symbolic icons that's used outside of the story, that's called non-diegetic. And also we can see this use of the visual, the presentation of visual ideation elements manipulated through this spatial arrangement that's called intensive. And also we can look at this affording option, that is naturalistic depiction of ideation events and some like attributes of characters or circumstantial entities. So they are the naturalistic depiction of certain visual ideation, and by doing that, trying to invoke this emphatic responses in readers. Okay, so later in here I'm going to provide some examples of how this kind of covert options are actually employed in my data. So due to the limitation of time, I'm focusing more on this affording option. Okay, so affording option referring to the evocation of attitudes in readers by naturalistic representation of visual ideation. So like events and circumstantial objects and human relationships. So this meaning-making strategy is also found in other types of visual semiosis, such as news photo. So for example, in news photo, we can see the depiction of human characters being injured, and this kind of depiction can effectively evoke this shared effect from readers. So in picture books, okay, we could notice similar kinds of like affording phenomenon. So the image in this slide is extracted from Liao's picture book story, Turn Left and Right, and depicting the final reunification of two story characters before they leave the city. It is interesting to know that when depicting this emotionally charged event, two story characters are depicted as far away from readers, and we cannot see clearly their facial expressions. Meanwhile, the image foregrounds the idea of connection between the two story characters, which in contrast with the depiction in the previous images, where the two story characters firstly, so in other words, the two story characters are firstly depicted as walking opposite toward each other in the previous images. And in this image, we can see this, they finally see each other. The idea of connection is being construed in this final reunification moment. So this image actually leaves more interpretative space to imagine what specific emotions, such as excitement or surprise or maybe joy, that the two story protagonists may be experiencing at the moment of the encounter. Okay, so in this instance, similarly, so in this slide, we can see another kind of way of doing this unfolding. So it draws on these non-adjacent images to represent some emotionally charged event taking place in the complicating stage of a story. So in this case, the image on spread 28 and 29, so they try to talk about, or they try to insinuate an event, okay? So an event where the two protagonists accidentally lose each other's telephone numbers after their first date, and therefore they cannot able to see each other again. So the two protagonists then revisit the place where they met before, but all they see is the ruin of the park and the pond. So this kind of event is actually not directly shown in the image, but it's kind of implied what happens in spread 28 and 29. Okay, so for example, first, as you can see in the spread 29, you can see simply that construes the idea of a fast changing environment in the verbiage, and also the images does not tell you exactly what is the scene is about. So you have to, so readers are actually expected to notice the intervisual link created through the reappearance, the visual ideation elements, such as the swans, broken trees, and pond. They're tracing back to the visual depiction in spread 15. So the contrast of the visual information between spread 15 and spread 20 and 29 hint at the reader's interpretation of the event construed in spread 20 and 29. So it is therefore interesting to know that while the facial expression of two story characters are not clearly represented in spread 29, negative emotional values such as disappointment and frustration can be evoked in readers by the implied event of not being able to meet each other, who in turn ascribe their feelings to the two story characters. So in other words, if readers understand what this, like spread 28 and 29, and this comparison between these two spreads and with previous spread 15, what this implied event is about, then readers' emotional responses could be effectively evoked. So to conclude this talk, this study has explored this instantiation of evaluative meanings in the picture book images of Liao's long picture book stories by drawing on the approach of SFMDA. So in general, the findings suggest that Liao's picture book stories, instead of directly inscribing specific emotional value through the verbal text, for example, using the verb saying that they are very sad not being able to see each other, they actually encourage readers to relive or experience certain social emotions, such as the emotion of love, hatred, or disappointment, by activating or resonating with readers' own comparable experiences in their own life. And in achieving this rhetorical function, we can find various information gaps created in Liao's picture book stories, inviting readers' interpretation. In this process, the interplay between images, adjacent or non-adjacent ones, plays an important role in the two picture book stories, as it creates additional layer of ideational and evaluative meanings for readers' interpretation. And therefore, this study contributes to the SFMD description of the evaluative meanings in picture book images by describing this kind of new data. And as we can see, like when we have different audiences, picture books tend to use different meaning making strategies to entertain or to achieve some kind of social functions. And of course, this study needs much more data to test, and also it just pointing towards some more interesting direction for the future study of picture book stories. Okay, so thank you for listening for my talk. Goodbye.